Hello again. In this lecture, I want to talk about two thinkers and the way that their work has been shaped by and shaped our understanding of the American Civil War as one example of how thinking about evil in a concrete situation may speak beyond that moment to a larger audience that spans generations, countries, even eras. Now, the Civil War was the greatest war in American history. In terms of its casualties, absolute and relative, it's still the greatest war. And as Abraham Lincoln recognized in his Gettysburg Address, it really constituted a kind of second American Revolution, a revolution of expectations and hopes and beliefs, and really argued for a revolution in the way people thought about the nation. And it's one whose consequences are still being worked out and debated today. My own family actually bears some of the marks of this history. My family is half Northern and half Southern, and my father always taught us to talk about the American Civil War as the War of Northern Aggression, which was quite a shock for us when we went to history class in school and discovered that it wasn't actually called that by many other people. But the war itself was not just vast, it was irremediably theological. It was fought out of theological arguments about slavery and God's purposes for humans, democracy, and even the meaning of liberty. Much of the best recent work on the Civil War by historians such as Mark Noll point to how it was, in Noll's own words, a theological crisis, a struggle between two utterly opposed understandings of Scripture and what God meant for the world. The central problem was the presence of slavery in American life. Now, slavery was not an accidental reality to America. It was deeper than that. It was close to the paradoxical heart of how Americans conceived of their mission in the world. And perhaps the way Americans had been moralized into conceiving of this mission led to the Civil War in some important ways. Here in this lecture, I want to look at how two thinkers explore this idea. One, Mark Twain, who offers a profound and searching diagnosis of this problem, though not much hope in the way of solving it. The other, Abraham Lincoln, who in a way that Twain and most of the rest of his contemporaries, Lincoln's contemporaries, failed to understand, gestured at a way that the nation might move towards some kind of healing beyond the war, and in so doing, identified a kind of revolution which may just have legs beyond the particular history of the United States. Again, this is not just a parochial moment about in the history of the U.S. It turns out, I think, to have deep implications for how many different social problems might be confronted around the world in a practical way. At least I want to propose that the problem that Twain identified and the way forward that Lincoln saw and prophesied may still be both of use today and in the future, in the U.S. and around the world. Because I want to talk about these issues in terms of the theme of American slavery, I want to talk about Twain first, as the person who formulated the problem, then turn back to Lincoln as one who, before Twain wrote, grasped the problem and suggested how it might be fruitfully addressed. So let me talk a bit here about Mark Twain and his remarkable work, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Ernest Hemingway famously said that The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is the greatest novel ever written in America. And most thinkers and most writers have agreed with Hemingway on that. Mark Twain is the pen name of Samuel Clemens. He was born in 1835 in Florida, but he was raised in Hannibal, Missouri, a slave state. In fact, it's important that Lincoln and Twain both had intimate experience of slavery growing up. Near the beginning of the Civil War, Twain went west, settling in San Francisco before moving back east in 1869. He published Huck Finn in 1885, and it was immediately recognized as his masterpiece, though he kept writing until he died in 1910. The novel, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, is about a boy's adventures on the Mississippi River, and it's generally got an overall kind of indirect misanthropic tone, depicting the ways that mid-19th century America was a place full of hucksters, con artists, and people easily fooled. That is, a place just like any other place in Twain's eyes. But at the emotional heart of the story is Twain's brilliant, clearly sincere protest against the kind of moral corruption that Huck both represents and is victimized by a moral corruption which infected the whole of his society. His crisis that reveals this moment, this crisis, this moral corruption, his crisis is easily described. Huck, who's just a white boy who lives along the river, and his friend, the slave Jim, are traveling along the Mississippi. And as they travel, it effectively means that Huck has helped Jim escape from Miss Watson, his master. After Huck does this, he comes to believe that he has stolen Jim, who would be $800 worth of commodity, right? What's worse, now that Jim believes he has his freedom, he means and he tells Huck that he will go back and help his wife and children escape, which Huck understands to be more theft. In fact, Huck says, upon hearing of Jim's plans to rescue his children from slavery, Huck says, "I was sorry to hear Jim say that. It was such a lowering of him." Huck, that is, comes to believe that he has committed and enabled to be more committed still a massive crime against a person who cared for him and trusted him. Now, what should he do? The crucial moment of Huck's realization and the beginning of the agony of the struggle of what he could do comes in the book's chapter 16, when he grasps that Jim's joy at being so close to his freedom means that he, Huck, must be very close to committing the final step of grand theft larceny by helping Jim. Memories of Miss Watson's many kindnesses come back to him, and how all her lessons of trying to make Huck a decent person are failing, just because he can't obey the law he knows, because he gets weak when he thinks of turning his friend, whom he loves, into the law. What Huck takes to be his conscience is racking him about this, making him think he is an utterly immoral person. Why? Because he can't turn his friend back in to a life of chattel slavery. That's the central irony there in Twain's story, right? The problem for Huck, and philosophers have written wonderful stuff about this, the problem for Huck is precisely that he understands himself to be morally wrong. Not just bad or weak, he thinks he knows the law. The law is you turn in property. He sees Jim, and his culture has taught him to think of Jim as a property. He also sees Jim, though, and sees him as a human. His sympathy for Jim wins out over his sense of the law. Much later in the story, about chapter 31 or so, Huck has a second chance to do what he thinks is the right thing, to turn Jim in. And he writes a note letting people on the shore know where he and Jim are. But again, he re-encounters the terrible power, and to his mind, the anti-moral power of his affection for Jim. Only this time, and this is even more devastating in Twain's telling, he frames the decision as one about the ultimate fate of his soul, because he knows that unless he obeys the law, God will certainly condemn him to hell for disobeying. So this is from Huck Finn, chapter 31. I took it up, the paper, the note he had written, and I held it in my hand. I was trembling because I had got to decide forever betwixt two things, and I noted. I studied a minute, sort of holding my breath, and then says to myself, all right then, I'll go to hell. And I tore it up. It's a great moment in American literature, right? Huck determining, almost like Milton's Satan, that I'll go to hell. But in this case, unlike Satan, Huck is doing the right thing. But he doesn't think it, so he thinks he's going to hell. It was awful thoughts and awful words, but they was said. And I let them stay said, and never thought no more about reforming. I shoved the whole thing out of my head, and said I would take up wickedness again, which was in my line, being brung up to it, and the other weren't, the other being the good line, the line of being a good person. And for a starter, I would go to work and steal Jim out of slavery again, and if I could think up anything worse, I would do that too, because as long as I was in, and in for good, I might as well go the whole hog. Now, some readings of the novel present this episode as a triumph of conscience over a wicked set of social mores, as if Huck understood himself as a heroic rebel. But that's not what he thinks. Huck understands himself to be a moral failure, a calamity for not following the moral law. The conflict here is between what Huck sees as his pre-rational, problematic, untutored sympathy, undisciplined sympathy for Jim, and the proper, upstanding, Victorian morality that Huck has been bred into, or has been tried to be bred into, by his society. Now, Twain, of course, suggests this morality is actually a horrific, hypocritical hostility to human beings. But Huck ends up seeing himself as weak because he takes the social norm as the only possible standard of conscience, no matter the violence it seems to do to his soul. The upshot of the situation, then, and the final twist of Twain's brilliance, is that Huck thinks he's going to hell. And so Huck, for being good, rejects morality and becomes not so much immoral as amoral. Now, the moral of this story, such as it is more or less oblique. Twain's got some suggestions for guidance, though not many. Most basically, we ought not ever to let morality, our beliefs about what's right and wrong, float too free from ordinary human empathy, lest our agency become wholly captive to unreal abstractions at the cost of attending to the real world. Twain thinks that's what happened in Huck's world. People were taught to see other people as property, as chattel, not as real humans. And he worries that any culture that can do that can go insane in very dangerous ways, apart from the fact that it enslaves human beings. It goes insane in other ways too. The conscience should be fed, he seems to be implying, both by rigorous and skeptical argument and by concrete attention to realities brought to our awareness by our vital human affections. The danger is in not seeing that any one version of morality, our version of morality, may need to be changed. And if it is not changeable, we may end up, like Huck, jettisoning our concern about morality altogether. Now, Twain took this to be a story not just about Huck, but also about America. The nation was so confident of its vision, so inflexible in attending to it, that it took its vision to be morally right, north and south, and it didn't leave any way to change or revise its moral imagination. And this is a recipe for moral catastrophe for Twain. It leads to a completely shallow self-righteousness, which may be strong initially, but is ultimately brittle, so that when it finally gives in to the facts of reality, such as the fellow feeling you might have when you consider a friend of yours as a real human, when you know you should see him as when you know, in the sense of believe, that you should see him as nothing more than someone else's property. And when it finally gives into these facts, this morality shatters. Now, in all this, it's a very acute psychology of how a society's vision of right and wrong can go horrendously awry. And in certain ways, it prophesies forward to what happens in the 20th century with various kinds of genocides. Especially, as we'll see, the work of Hannah Arendt resonates with Twain quite powerfully on the Holocaust. But here we don't see Twain offering much of a positive solution to the problem he so devastatingly diagnoses. His vision is in some important way too misanthropic. To see how to go forward here, we actually have to go back to Lincoln and to Lincoln's greatest speech, perhaps the greatest speech of American political history, Lincoln's second inaugural address. Now, Abraham Lincoln, as most people will know, lived from 1809 to 1865. He was raised with little education, but again, like so many others we have seen, undertook a strenuous process of self-education throughout his early life. He served in the militia in the Black Hawk War of 1832, and then was a lawyer and legislator in Illinois, and served even a term in Congress in Washington as a representative, where he made his first national reputation as one of the very few who opposed the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 48 as an unbridled effort of human imperialism, which Lincoln thought was beneath the dignity of the American Republic. His opposition to that war, of course, which went swimmingly for the United States, also cost him his seat after one term, since the people back home like the idea of America conquering the West. He was a surprising choice for president, first in the Republican primary and then in the general election, but became perhaps the greatest president the U.S. has yet known, his only real rivals being George Washington and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He gave many great speeches, but none greater than his second inaugural address. Now, this address, given in the midst of war, in the midst of civil war, in the early spring of 1865, as the war was coming to its conclusion, can serve as a kind of potential hypothetical roadmap for where Lincoln would have liked the nation to go. As in so many of his speeches, it was brief and very surprising. Most surprising, indeed, for its refusal to give in to the temptation to be vindictive, judgmental, or punitive to those people in the South who had resisted the war. In the address, in fact, Lincoln offers a quite theological work. He reads the Civil War itself, as we'll see, as God's judgment on the people of the United States, as he says, North and South, as punishment for their collective complicity in the sin of slavery. Right? The point here is not to excuse the South. The point is to implicate himself and those other people who were on the side of the North. Again, this is not an attempt to whitewash Southern slavery. It's an attempt to expand the complicity to all of America. Along with justice, then, prophets like Lincoln want to say that public life has a destiny beyond justice, a destiny that will transfigure our mundane life and not renounce it. Let me read this to you once, and then I want to go through and give you a comment on it as well. This is the crucial part of the speech. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange to us that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us judge not, that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. Now, this is a very long sentence, the one that's coming up here. This suggests something of the difficulty of the thought being offered and the necessity of a long time to be taken for the thoughts being worked out. So pay attention to the length here. Okay, this is an important sentence. If we shall suppose that American slavery, note, it's not Southern slavery, is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs come, right? It must happen by some mysterious providence, again, going back to Job, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives, note, God gives, to both North and South, this terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. This terrible war. He speaks this to an audience, many of them soldiers, many of them widows or orphans of soldiers, many of them wounded in the war, all of them with intimate acquaintance of what the war has cost. A terrible war. A war so vast and so expansive that at this point, the war has changed the face of America, and everyone in the crowd knows it. This terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Note, both North and South. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Think about that sentence. The whole point of that sentence is framed as a theodicy question. It's a question about whether or not we can imagine this God is just. Is this God a just God? That's the question that's being asked here. But within that asking of a question, inside of it, Lincoln frames the whole history of the war as a theological punishment to the nation as a whole, a punishment that is due to the nation as a whole for its collective sins. He has turned what would have been, what was for so many of his contemporaries, a Manichaean dualism of good and evil. For the South, the good South and the evil North. For the North, the good North and the evil South. This dualism of good and evil. He has turned it into two sides of a community, both of whom have sinned grievously in God's eyes, out of God's mysterious providence. And now God chooses to punish them and thus expiate their sins through this punishment. Now, note next this next very brief sentence. In the middle of this sentence and then the one that's going to come immediately after, which is also very long, in the middle of these two sentences, this brief little moment of human longing. It rhymes, too. He clearly did this on purpose. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Right? That's the human hoping for this. And in a way, sincerely, but the rhyming of it makes it sound a little almost too musical. And now Lincoln goes again into one of these vast periodic sentences, and it's wonderful. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled up by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Just stop there for a second. First of all, in American politics today, there's a lot of worries about God language and the pervasiveness of God language. I actually think that Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address is perhaps the most profound piece of theology that America as a continent has produced. I'm including Mexico and Canada here. America as a continent has produced in the last 500 years. I mean, if we talk about having religion in politics, this is about as religious as political speech can get. He's just interpreted American history as a process of God's judgment on the people for the crime of slavery. Now, what's interesting about this is that he's doing this in a way that's not entirely something he always does. He's a very good writer, but Lincoln actually early on was known as someone who was a problematic freethinker. He seems to have been someone who lots of people suspected wasn't actually very religious at all. And a lot of his earlier speeches do not speak about God in this way. Certainly this is a theme that he begins to work out over the course of the Civil War, how surprising this war has been and how it teaches us that there's a larger lesson being conveyed. But in a way, he chooses this register in the final, most public speech. Well, he doesn't know it's the final, but the most public speech of the end of the Civil War. He really thinks at this point he's pivoting his political leadership now away from fighting this war to healing the nation. And what's interesting is he identifies the register in which to deal with this problem as a theological register. Both sides of this war were deeply, as I said, theological. Both sides understood themselves to be fighting on God's cause, on God's side. And what Lincoln suggests is that you can understand the moral energies of both sides, but you can redirect them. You can change their orientation and make them understand not that they are fighting in a crusade, but that they are fighting as penitents in a war that works out their own complicity in sin. And you let God decide the outcome of that war as a way of resolving that sin in some ultimate sense. And this is why the end of this speech is so remarkably full of a human spirit which, after the Civil War, after Lincoln's assassination, seem to be lacking. Again, North and South, maybe lacking for another century in American history. Think about this. A war leader at the end of the bloodiest war his nation has ever fought, a war more bloody than anyone had imagined it would be. Think about him saying this: with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in. And then think about how he describes this work: to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Now, that's a devastating speech. I actually think that all American students should be forced to memorize that speech. But it's an astonishing speech for, as I said, a number of reasons. It's theological register for a person who wasn't apparently very theological, or at least the rumors were. A speech of remarkable mercy from a war leader about to defeat his enemies. Mercy that no one else on his side, and as far as we could tell, no one on the other side would have offered at this point. But more than mercy, an astonishing invitation for both sides to reconsider what they are in, not so much as a just war against evil, but as a history of punishment, a history of just punishment, providentially just, that all ought to accept and reply to with humility. Remember again that the war itself was fought by two sides of remarkably similar theological conviction, though profoundly opposed theological assessment of the rectitude of their two causes. They talked past each other, and in part because they both started from the same simplistic proof-texting approach to religion. He had it right, Lincoln had it right, when he said that both sides read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. They both believed that the other side was godless and would lead the nation to godlessness, either the godlessness of an industrial technocracy where honor and extra monetary value has no place, or the godlessness of slave drivers driving the whole nation back to a heartless, feudal barbarism. They found no way to see the war as anything other than a holy war, a war of pure good against pure evil. Now, Lincoln saw the evil that lay at the core of the war itself, the vast and dehumanizing system of chattel slavery, which was possibly the most brutal system of human exploitation the world has known outside of intentional, genocidal, or mass homicidal activities, such as those performed by the Nazis, Stalinist Russia, or the Aztecs. I mean, chattel slavery in North America before the American Civil War was a really nasty, deadly thing. Don't let apologists fool you. But Lincoln saw also that this evil was one that both North and South had collaborated in producing, both North and South had profited from, and that both needed to confront their complicity in this evil. And in this, Lincoln offers a vision of how to think about evil and how to think about our own involvement in evil that might be of use, might be of power, beyond his own context. He was able not just to see what the Bible said, he was able to see how to read the Bible and to read the signs of the times. And you can only do the former, he seems to imply, if you also do the latter. You have to understand the Bible, you have to understand your religious heritage in light of the history you're going through. And yet you understand that history only through reading it in light of the Bible that you believe in. Now, in doing this, Lincoln is suggesting that there's a way in which humans can come to diffuse their tendencies towards dualism in vast moral conflicts and invite their enemies not simply to be their enemies, but also to be their fellow humans in a struggle far deeper than the war that they are maybe immediately involved in. In offering that picture, Lincoln offers a solution that others will pick up after him, both in the United States and beyond. Whenever they reach out to their enemies, instead of trying to polarize their enemies, they try to convince them of the rectitude of their own cause or their understanding of a mutual project that they both can be involved in. Now, both Twain and Lincoln were themselves prophets well ahead of their time. As I said, Twain seems to predict the way that a society can misshape its adherents in ways that only scholars of the Holocaust in the next century will parallel at all. And his own appreciation, Twain's own appreciation of how morality can conspire to reinforce racism, is at the heart of thinkers like Martin Luther King's insistence that the civil rights struggle was a struggle as much for white people as for black people. And Lincoln's insistence that all would be complicit and should recognize their own complicity is always a salutary reminder that in an age such as ours, of culture wars and rumors of culture wars, Americans are always one people for good and ill, and that we, the people, are united both in our aspirations and in our crimes, and must understand our common destiny in blessing and in punishment. But beyond America, Lincoln's lesson is powerful beyond that as well. People caught in interminable and moralistic wars can see a problem as one that many people have cooperated in producing, and thus they can come to see the solution they must deal with, they must reach, as one that all must have a hand in order to achieve it. We have been the ones to sin, Lincoln said, and so for us to move beyond the sin, all of us must understand the costs we must accept. If you think about large-scale social revolutionary movements in the 20th century, Nelson Mandela and the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, Václav Havel, Adam Michnik in Eastern Europe, the United States Civil Rights Movement, again and again and again, the strategy is not to set up a simple opposition or more than an opposition than was necessary, but always to welcome the other as more than just an enemy, as more than just a rival, as more than just Shaitan, the old enemy that we used to see even in the ancient Near East. Again and again, the mythology of dualism is powerful in ways that escape merely philosophical depictions of good and evil. And again, we find that if there are ways of resolving and overcoming that dualism, we may find ourselves better able to live into the future.